I'm Shelby, and this is Filmish Chats. Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Cook, head curator and editor-in-chief at Film East. And today I'm joined by Will Schofield to discuss Joachim Trier's The Worst Person in the World. This episode is part of Film East Online, a space for free online content in varying media to educate, inform, and inspire all things cinema. Film East is a multi-award-winning global film organization based in the east of England and the east coast of the US. You can view all of our free film criticism publications, podcast episodes, and interviews by visiting film-east.com. The final film in Joachim Trier's Oslo trilogy, The Worst Person in the World, chronicles 4 years in the life of Julie, a young woman who navigates the troubled waters of her love life and struggles to find her career path, leading her to take a realistic look at who she really is. In this episode, Will and I discuss the philosophical questions raised throughout the film, including the purpose of art in politics, the implications of quote-unquote woke culture on society, and the place of feminism in our current world. But most importantly, we answer the question, is Julie really the worst person in the world? Plus, I give you a sneak peek at Trier's newest film, Sentimental Value, which I got to see this year at the Toronto Film Festival. You can read my full review of Sentimental Value, plus view all of our TIFF coverage by visiting film-east.com/TIFF-50. Without further ado, here's Filmish chatting about The Worst Person in the World. I noticed while I was going back through all of my TIFF stuff when I was editing everything, I start every conversation with anyone ever. I go, and it's so annoying. Every time I listen back to these, I'm like, and it's just like, girl, you gotta stop that. It's the smack. Every single time.
Have you rehearsed a new intro for this one then? New
I'm gonna
call.
I'm gonna fight every willpower to say, and I literally just almost said it, but today we're talking about the worst person in the world. See, I did it without doing, um, um, I said, but I'm not gonna say so. I'm not gonna do it. Will, what are your thoughts on this movie? Was it your first time seeing it?
It was a movie that came out a few years ago, and I remember hearing a lot of buzz about it. And they only showed it a couple of times to me, and I just kept missing it every time. Um, and it was one that has been on the watch list for a while. So I was very happy when you finally gave me the push to watch it. And yeah, it wasn't what I was expecting. I was a lot more, I guess, calm.
Mm.
I think with the title like The Worst Person in the World, I expect it to be more dramatic and there to be a bit more bombast, but it was very honest in its emotions and ironically, I'd say quite realistic in a lot of ways, despite there being a lot of kind of unusual and fantastical elements kind of sprinkled throughout. I yeah, I didn't expect it to be as kind of placid's not the right word. That sounds insulting, but yeah, kind of I guess
More grounded in
um
like realism.
yeah, grounded is a good way of putting it.
There is a film that came out, another Norwegian film that came out the year after Worst Person in the World called Sick of Myself. And I
Mm.
feel like those two titles should have been changed because in what you're describing is in Sick of Myself is exactly what she does. This girl is like a total like attention whore. And she just continues to like do these things to like affect her body so that way everyone gives her all this attention. So she takes these intense drugs so she gets really sick, and then I think she burns her face off too at one point. It's just like it's
Oh
crazy.
my God.
It's like the most intense, but they're very similar. It's very similar to Worst Person in the World, but
like you were just describing, the title should have been switched because this girl in Sick of Myself is truly the worst person in the world.
Yeah, because that's one of the. I mean, that's one of the first things that I feel I should raise is the title. Do you
Yeah,
think she was the worst person in the world?
yeah.
Because I think there's probably worse people out there. I mean, what do you think?
Well, let's hold that question for next. And
Mm,
I'll tell you about my experience first watching this,
okay.
and then we'll address whether I think she's the worst person in the world. Um, I watched this film for the first time at the London Film Festival. It was when it was COVID, so it was all online. And I was laying in my bed, sobbing my eyes out, just emotionally punched in the face over and over and over again. I was like, I have never in my life. It had the same impact as normal people had to me. And you know how I am about
Hmm.
normal people. Um, Go watch our normal people episode. Our normal people recording popped off. We have like
Oh
20K
yeah.
on YouTube. It just like it went off.
We should
Um,
keep going someday.
yeah, we should
They
keep
clamor for
watching the
more.
rest of it.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I just immediately fell in love with this movie. Um, had seen it one more time since then because I went and saw a screening of it in New York with Joachim Trier and Renata was there. That's how much I loved it. I went to New York just to
Wow.
see this because I was like, I just love this movie so much. And but I hadn't seen it since then, since the other night when I rewatched it for this. And I'm so glad I left that space in between seeing it because it was enough time that I still knew the general plot, but I like a lot of the main details I kind of had forgotten, but it still just punched me in the face. It was still the same emotional wallop, right? You know, at the end where it just gets you. And I'm really happy because there's a lot of times where like I'm scared to rewatch movies that I loved so much the first time I watched it because I don't want to watch it again and be like, ooh, I don't, like because you change, you evolve in your taste, you change in your life. It doesn't have the same emotional impact, but I'm so glad that this film still had that same emotional impact and still hit me the same. And it was just, I think it's just such a beautiful exploration of being lost in, your late 20s, your early 30s, not quite knowing where you belong. It's a very grounded view of a very specific moment in time. Do I think she's the worst person in the world? That's interesting that's the first question that you have. When I was rewatching it, I noticed it's the boyfriend, the other what's his name? Uh,
Axel or
no, not
not Axel?
Axel.
Oh
Edvin,
no, what is his name?
the one that she cheats with. Um,
Yeah.
he's the one that says, "I feel like the worst person in the world," in the film. So it's interesting that the
Um,
film labels him as the worst person in the world. Is it because she doesn't have the awareness to think that she's the worst person in the world? Is it that she really doesn't believe that she's the worst person in the world? Are we not supposed to believe that she's the worst person in the world? Um, I kind of have always viewed this film as a sort of like very much in line with Fleabag,
mm,
uh, where the protagonist is not a typical protagonist where you really don't agree with a lot of the stuff that she does, but you feel sympathy for her, you love her. And that's kind of where I viewed this idea of her being the worst person in the world is it's sort of grounded in this self-hatred.
yeah.
She views herself as the worst person in the world because she's making all these mistakes. She leaves her longtime boyfriend and then he gets cancer and dies. Like, like that does make you feel like a horrible person. And it makes you feel like a horrible person because she didn't go to the hospital when they called and said he's not going to make it through the night and she doesn't go. That makes you feel like you're the worst person in the world. Um, in like your grounded little bubble of your existence. That's where it is. Um, what are your thoughts?
I think I thought similar. I thought the title was very much about her own. feelings about herself. I found it quite interesting. See, that's my catchphrase. That's what I say all the time. The early on attend a dinner party and they kind of get a little bit drunk and a little bit
Yep.
dancey, and she ends up, I think, like smashing a bowl on a woman's head and causing like a
Well,
big argument.
yeah, the husband picks her up and she hits her head on the lamp.
Yes, that's it. And she very much takes the blame for it, or at least she blames herself. And you hear that a huge argument starting out between the couple in the room, but then the next day you see them and everything's fine, and they're like hugging again. They're hugging on the dock, and it's quite romantic. But we see the whole sequence of her blaming herself and like feeling bad and going through those motions, and I feel that's kind of quite similar to almost how the movie ends, where at the very end, all that stuff's happened, but she's still just kind of keeping on living life and things are looking kind of okay. And it's that idea that you do have these fleeting moments of absolute self-loathing, like she was having near constantly throughout the movie. But ultimately, from the outside, it's never really as bad as you think it is. There's things will work themselves out for the most part. I mean, obviously there's stuff like cancer, which tends not to work itself out, but yeah, I do think that kind of very hyperbolic title is, yeah, I mean, I took it kind of at face value. It's just her, um, how she saw herself,
Mhm.
um, throughout.
And it sort of plays on this idea that I want to address is sort of the anti-feminist feminist themes that play throughout this film.
Mm,
So, and I want to start this with a caveat of saying we are having this discussion. This is not necessarily, we're not spiraling this into something that it doesn't need to be. I've been thinking a lot about woke culture. I mean, obviously, we're in a big cultural war here in the US. Uh,
mm,
and I've been thinking a lot about the idea of people limiting themselves from having challenging conversations on either side of the spectrum,
mm,
whether it's left or right. I'm not just purely talking about the right, and I'm not talking about people saying problematic things for the sake of clickbait. I'm not saying we should all be going out spewing fascist ideology. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, the nuances, the gray areas of the world, the idea that yes, Charlie Kirk was a total fascist, but was he right to say we all have the right to have free speech? Yes, he was absolutely right to say that, but he was a total freaking fascist. We don't have that gray area anymore where we can talk about those challenging things or have those really difficult philosophical questions. Because I think we are all afraid of offending people and we want to censor ourselves. And I think that's how we've gotten into this situation that we're in now, where it's like it's on such extremes. I feel like watching this movie, it is in a way a sort of, I don't know if this is a proper title, proper way to put this, but just the way I'm putting it right now is sort of an anti-woke movie. There's a lot of conversations about feminism. There's a lot of conversations about the place of art, and it's all grounded in a very specific moment in time. They make a clear reference to the Me Too era and COVID. The epilogue obviously is set during COVID because they're all wearing their masks and they're social distancing. Um, Thinking specifically about the piece that Julie writes about blowjobs in a post-Me Too world and how women feel like they shouldn't have to give blowjobs anymore because, we're feminists, we're woke, we don't have to do that. But Julie writes this piece that is very evocative of giving blowjobs. Um, the idea that she's challenging these sort of feminist themes. But then there's also the question of it's written by a man. I I don't I that's my perspective. And I also, while you're thinking about it, is the scene between Axel and the interviewer
Mm.
when he's on that radio show, and it goes terribly wrong. She's challenging him about his misogynistic comics of his past, and he's trying to defend it. Is there a sort of onus on the interviewer for very clearly not allowing him to defend himself? Every time he tries to defend himself, she jumps in and challenges him again. Is there a problem with the interviewer not putting into perspective what he's doing now? Yes, you should challenge people for what they've done in the past, but is that always going to define who you are in the future? Is sort of this idea of cancel culture, or are we just going to cancel someone because they wrote bad comics when they were young versus what they're doing now? Um, and in that same conversation, Axel talks about he uses his art as a way to express these sort of challenging things, these ideas that he's not going to do these things to women. But it's sort of this, platform, this way of projecting these desires. Should we censor art from presenting these things because they are challenging, because they are problematic? Think about video games and violence. What influence does that have on society?
I think that starting with the interview sequence at the end, I think what I found interesting with that scene is that I agree that it started out very much kind of the interviewer came across very unreasonable. She was yelling over him and making very harsh accusations about him and his content and stuff like that. Um, However, I came away from it because towards the end, when he's able to kind of finally start speaking, his points felt very empty to me, and he was very quick to turn around and just make it insults.
Hmm.
And yes, he makes the point about, freedom of speech and be able to draw what he want and it being art. But then earlier in the movie, his big gripe with his film, his work becoming mainstream and they're making a movie out of it, is that they've censored the character's butthole, like
Hmm.
the little 5 stars of the
Yep.
butthole. And that seemed to be kind of a big crux of their argument. And it's like, yeah, on one hand, I can see his point of he should be allowed to make these points and he can say it's a statement on misogyny and stuff. But at the same time, looking at it, it's a cartoon butthole,
Yeah.
that he's defending. I think I think it's difficult to talk about Axel and his work without because he's a very clearly to me a pastiche of Robert Crumb,
Hmm.
who was a very popular cartoonist in the 70s in America in the underground comic scene, and he made tons and tons and tons of stuff. He was addicted. He made a character called Fritz the Cat, who got a movie in the 70s that was fairly controversial for being very adult, although framed like a kids movie. Um, and he had many very similar conversations. And his work had a very misogynistic undertone to it, and a lot of people viewed it as a very wrapping around to post-feminist in its depiction, whereas a lot of others. And there's a fantastic documentary about him, one of the best documentaries ever made, called Crumb, that I highly recommend people go and search out. Um, but I think it's interesting to kind of see that argument juxtaposed from the 70s to the 90s now onto the modern day. And I think what I found really striking about the conversation is that it's not on both sides of the argument, nothing was really said.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
it's a conversation that we've all heard a million times on the news or on television or on online or stuff of the two sides. And like you made a comment about how like nowadays these people can't really say anything without getting either cancelled from either side. But I wonder if it's more than that. That these debates have always been there's a key ideological difference at the core that cannot be reconciled. The women's argument is that his the stuff that he's made is innately misogynistic, and it doesn't matter about the intentions of it. It's the depiction, what he's depicting is inherently harmful,
Mhm.
which can't really be reconciled. And his argument was that it doesn't matter who it harms. It doesn't matter if it harms anyone because the freedom of expression is more important.
Mhm.
And again, these are two. I'd say both are quite true in a sense, but they don't quite gel together. And then rather than like coming to any sort of conclusion, it's just yelling at each other. I thought it was interesting how kind of horrified the main I've forgotten the main character's name,
Julie.
Julie, um was at viewing it. And I've thought about that quite a lot, and I couldn't quite tell what horrified her that much. I wasn't sure if it was seeing Axel get into such an aggressive state on television, or him being humiliated in that way, or whether his views shocked and appalled her. Um, I mean, it's the first time we've really seen him outside of her in a sense, and so I don't know if she disagreed with the points he was making. Um,
See, I
but
actually read her reaction completely differently. I
really,
thought she was not happy at the conversation, but she was just so enamored to see him again. See,
oh,
that's kind of,
okay.
I kind of saw her not as shocked, but as, well, shocked,
Mm,
but as in, oh my God, it's Axel. Like, here he is. And that's, she's not really listening to what the conversation is that's being had. That was my interpretation of it.
that's interesting.
And that she was just
Yeah.
more engrossed with, there he is, he's doing his thing, he's still, because she hasn't seen him in so long.
Mm,
Um, and it's also interesting because when she first meets Axel, the narrator says she thinks his comics are extremely misogynistic and she doesn't like them. She doesn't think they're funny. Yet she continues to flirt with him,
yeah.
continues to, you know, and that's sort of the, if, I don't want to say if she was following true feminist ideology, but if she was staunchly in her, anti-man feminist perspective, she would have been like, "You're gross," just, that she would have not even dealt with him.
Mm,
But it was the fact that she could put that aside and say, she knows that it's misogynistic, that his comics are not appropriate. But that doesn't stop her from continuing having the conversation with him. And
yeah.
maybe in their relationships, I would imagine perhaps she raised those things with him because it seemed like they had that relationship where they had those really deep philosophical questions. They talked a lot about those things. And they say that no one's going to be able to talk to each other like we will. And maybe Julie changed the way that he made his comics, because
Mm.
he did go down a different path with his writing.
That's true. Yeah, he very early on in the film makes it quite clear that he's not doing that
Yeah.
stuff anymore. Shortly after, and that's about when she starts. That's about when she starts losing interest in him, though. Basically, after he says that, she immediately goes away. That's an interesting. Um,
Are you not interesting anymore?
yeah.
There's nothing about you. You're just, another average
Mm.
person.
I did find it interesting. Oh, I find everything interesting. The kind of short work that she writes about blowjobs, and it's interesting because it is, I suppose, it's not. I don't think it's necessarily an anti-feminist. It's certainly not written from an anti-feminist perspective, and I don't think um the topic she's talking about, the in enjoyment of giving a blowjob, is necessarily an anti-feminist
Yeah, I agree.
thing. But it's quite interesting how, well, first of all, it's one of the only kind of works of art we really see that's from a a woman's perspective, um, and written by a woman, and also how quick she is to kind of try and hide it away and defend it from any criticism, and how careful she is. Whereas she's been spending so long with Axel, who's constantly sat there in his board, drawing his big old buttholes on a big sheet of
Yeah.
paper, and can get away with that, and going on national television to discuss it, and getting a movie deal. Whereas like attempt at kind of expressing, I guess, similar and more nuanced ideas is panicked and rushed and carefully curated. Um,
And it's framed as the perspective of the most successful thing about it is it started a subpar Facebook debate. That's what the narrator
yeah,
says. It sparked a debate on Facebook, whereas Axel's having these debates on these major platforms. That is a really good point.
and even in the movie itself, it was like the shortest segment by far. It was like a couple minutes long, and then it just moved on.
Mhm.
Um, even the movie's not giving it the time of day.
Um, I think what's interesting about this film, we didn't get to watch the rest of the Oslo trilogy.
Mm.
Um, the other two films also star, what's his name? Anders Dansolin Lai. I hope I'm saying that right. Um, as the main character. They are very male forward. I don't even think there's any female characters in the other films. Um,
Wow.
I think the first one is about Anders' friend I think they're all writers. Anders is more successful than his friend. I think his friend's the main character. And his friend's trying to figure out his voice and figure out where he is as a writer, whatever. The second one, also August 31st, is Anders as a recovering drug addict, and he's let out of his rehab facility for a day, and he goes back out into Oslo and sort of faces those challenges that he faces in trying to stay clean, confronting the people that he's hurt in his past, type of thing. Whereas this one is very female forward. Joachim has said that him and his co-writer, they don't write characters based on gender. They just write the character and then assign the gender to it afterwards. Um, do you think that sort of, I don't want to say it's like a naive way of writing. I think it's a very smart way of writing. It's a very forward-thinking way of writing female characters. Do you think that adds to the character or takes away from her? Because she has these more masculine sort of traits, this ability to just dump her boyfriend, move on to the next thing. What's what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that they say that's how they write stuff,
Yeah.
and then as you point out, the first two movies have basically no females in it. It's
Yeah.
interesting that they
Mhm.
always happen to land back into that wheelhouse. But no, I think she was. I did find her a very well written character. I found her very, realistic, and honest. And if that's the technique they utilize, then I think it's an impressive job. Kind of, I guess basically it's an attempt to overcome internalized misogyny
Yeah.
to and avoid that perspective. Um, but I mean, but at the same time, I think gender is such an integral part of this movie that, and her being a woman surrounded by a bunch of men basically the entire time is very important to it. Um, I think about her like interaction, I mean, with her dad
Yeah.
and how it had to be in the end. Axel was the one who had to stand up for her,
Mhm.
which does feel like a very typically, brash men action.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, the film it deals with pregnancy a bunch. It deals with her periods, and um, I don't know. I guess yeah. I guess if that's what it takes to have written a character with as much depth and I guess a character as her, then good on them. But I don't think. But I do think in a work like this where gender is so important, it's um it can be avoided really. That they can pretend that it was written completely neutrally.
And
Um,
I keep returning. I always compare this work with Fleabag. I think that
yeah,
Fleabag and Julie are very similar characters. And I do think it's one perspective of where the woman is written by a man, but she's written very well by men. Whereas Fleabag is written by a woman. and they're
Mm.
very similar. They have a very similar arc. I don't know where I mean, I really don't see much differences in terms of the actual characters. The way that they interact with the world, I think, is very different in being written by a man versus being written by a woman. But the way that they're presented, this sort of, going against how we think women should be, is very similar. Um,
Mm.
but I do always kind of find it a bit weird that Joachim's always like, it's not about gender. Well, it is. I mean, I guess an artist, that's the point of critics. You place emphasis on and you create meaning as a viewer versus what the artist
Mm.
intended. But it is his films are very gendered. Even his early works, I think, maybe not intentionally, but they are. The reprise is there's a whole scene that's extremely misogynistic about these sort of like on the brink of being fascist, you know, young men talking about women's place in society. It's very like, oh, okay, this is a little much, Joachim. But again, I think he's raising these challenging questions, and I think it's important that we have these opportunities. Not that we should give credit to artists for being challenging. I don't think it's not necessarily like, oh, good on you for raising feminist questions and raising questions about wokeness and where our culture is going. It's more about the audience sitting back and viewing what they have seen and thinking critically about it and saying, you know what, that was that whole scene was a bit was not the best. It was not appropriate. It wasn't, it really didn't hasn't aged well. It didn't sit well. And I think that's where the onus is on the viewer too. And I think that's what Axel, where that whole conversation was going. Axel was defending his work from the perspective of an artist. I don't think, once a work of art is out in the public, an artist doesn't have onus of it anymore because a viewer
Yeah.
is bringing their own lived experience, their own perspective to a work. And you had that sort of two dichotomy of the viewer, who is the interviewer, who was telling him what his work was saying, versus the artist who said, "This isn't my intention. You're reading into it. You're creating things that aren't there." But both of their perspectives are real. They're both of them are genuine. Um, but it's about that understanding of what's in the middle, understanding that
Mm.
her perspective is different from what the artist intended. A lot of people follow that ideology that what the artist intended is what it's about. That's what a lot of people think. And I
Mm.
I don't follow that ideology. I think what we present, what we view the art to be is what it is. Um, of course, we could take into consideration what the artist says, but that doesn't necessarily dictate, Joachim might say this isn't a gendered movie, but I think you and I both agree it's a gendered movie.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that this film has a lot of depth to it. It has a lot of emotion to it, of course, um, which is on first viewing. I think you get so swept up in the emotion of it. I mean, I know I did, and it was rewatching it again that I really started to notice a lot of these nuances to it that I really found quite interesting. What do you think? I guess we'll wrap it up here. Um, what do you think of the technical aspects of the film? Um, there's a narrator. There's some frozen in time scenes. You kind of talked to, I think, I don't know what word you said specifically, but I think you said a little bit of like whimsical um,
Mm.
thing in the beginning. Do you think that they work? Personally, I don't like the narrator. I don't think the narrator works in the story.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I really love a narrator. I love like a kind of slightly quirky narrator who makes little tried asides and jokes to the audience. I love it in The Lobster. I love it here. But that's a personal
Even
thing. I think I kind of agree that like it doesn't in retrospect, it perhaps didn't feel quite right for the movie. It felt important to kind of get some of those. points across, like you said earlier. It mentioned about the her essay ending up just building a argument in the comment sections.
Yeah,
Um, but I think I do think that it didn't quite toe the line of magical realism enough. I didn't mind the first time she like stops time and that kind of sequence that happened because it felt like, it uh there's an old expression that in musicals when the emotions get too big to talk about, they sing, and when they get too big to sing about, they dance. And it kind of felt like that. It was such an intense emotional sequence that her kind of breaking out of the realism of the world to try and kind of visualize it worked. But they repeated it later, and I did feel it was a bit diminishing returns. I really didn't care for the mushroom sequence
yeah,
where she gets really high, and I suppose it's meant to be her dealing with her inner demons, but it was just so on the nose and a bit goofy, and
I agree. Yeah.
yeah, that it just didn't land for me, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. The frozen time scene, the the first time it happens, oh, brilliant. I
Mm,
think that it just encapsulates this, oh, if only we could freeze time and test to make sure that this big decision I'm about to make is going to be the right one. Um, and then she comes back and then she can break up with Axel. She had this fantastical interaction with this new man, and she did feel a spark. It was, it did work out, and so she knows now she can go back to Axel and break up with him. Um, Perhaps, even now that I'm just thinking about this, perhaps that is the cheating. Maybe she does cheat on Axel. Maybe she does go and have an affair with this man before she breaks up with Axel, because that's
mm.
typically what happens, you find love somewhere else and then you break up with your partner. Um, yeah, I thought that was very pointed. I didn't like really a lot of the other things. I think the mushroom sequence, yeah, I didn't think it was necessary because it doesn't really, yes, she has this vision of her dad, but that's like nothing really comes of it. It doesn't, I think
Yeah.
he says something to her and then she throws her tampon at at him, and that's the extent of it. It doesn't really add much to the story. Yeah, it was a bit weird. Her like aged body looked really, really bad. Like that was just
Yeah.
terrible prosthetics. Um, Again, and that again plays to this idea of feminists. She's very vain, obviously. That's what she's concerned about in this moment of crisis that she's having, is
Yeah.
being old and saggy and wrinkly. Um, um, I want to talk a little bit about sentimental value. So I got to see sentimental value at TIFF. It's Joachim's next film. A lot of the same collaborators. That's very Joachim style, is working with the same people over and over again. Renata is the star of that one as well. Um, and obviously, I think it's very highly anticipated because Worst Person in the World was so well received and people love Worst Person in the World. So this follow-up is, very anticipated. I want to start by saying sentimental value, I feel, is Joachim's most mature work. I think it's very intentional. It's very deliberate, and everything works well in it to tell the story that he's trying to tell. We were just criticizing the technical aspects of Worst Person in terms of like the narrator, these sort of weird whimsical moments. Joachim returns to these things and uses them to perfection in sentimental value. It fits perfectly in the story. It works so well. Um, so Worst Person kind of is this like test to see, you can see that he's experimenting with these things. It's not quite working in the story, but he brings them back and it works really well. I think what I was disappointed with Sentimental Values is it didn't have that emotional oomph that Worst Person in the World has. Worst Person in the World is so raw and it's so grounded in human emotions, and there's a lot of messiness, and I think that, the technical things that aren't quite working adds to that sort of messiness. You can tell that it's still kind of an experiment, where sentimental values is so meticulous and so artistically forward that it kind of becomes a little cold, and those big emotional moments don't hit as impactfully. Do I think Sentimental Values is a brilliant film? Yes. I think it very Bergman-esque. I think it's Joachim's best work. I think it is very much a beautiful work of art. Is it as evocative as memorable as Worst Person in the World? Maybe not. I so that all that to say, I think Worst Person in the World is a better film than Sentimental Values. From my perspective, I would watch Worst Person in the World again over Sentimental Values, but I still think Sentimental Value is a brilliant film, and that's not to dismiss it as what it is. It stand alone without any perspective of Worst Person in the World. Absolutely beautiful film. It might even be on like masterpiece level because it's just so brilliantly constructed, but it lacks that sort of emotion that we see in Worst Person in the World, which is what I was really looking forward to. I was hoping that it would hit the core as much, but it just didn't. So we've been rambling on for a while. Do you have any final thoughts on our
Uh,
worst person in the world?
well, we promised at the beginning, and it's time to bring it back again. Do you think she is the worst person in the world?
No, I don't think she's the worst person in the world. I think she's human. And
Ah.
I think that's why she thinks she's the worst person in the world. There's plenty of other worse people in the world. I can think of one right now who's orange. But no, I don't think Julie, and I think that's what makes her human is that she thinks that about herself.
Hmm. Not only is she not the worst person in the world, this wasn't the worst movie in the world.
It
So
wasn't the worst.
that's
There you
my
go. There's
that's
there's
my
the
review.
letterbox line. Very good, very good.
Hopefully, you enjoyed this episode of Film East Chats. To learn more about Film East and our film criticism publications, upcoming events, and unique activities, visit our website, film-east.com, or follow us on any of our social media at films with an S underscore East. Make sure you're subscribed to Film East Chats anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube, so you never miss one of our deep dives into films and TV. Again, we're Film East, a global film organization. Catch you next time.